There is an island in the Indian Ocean that most people will never hear of. It is less than 1 square kilometer. It has no trees. No rivers. No shade. Its highest point is 7 meters above sea level, low enough that a moderate wave could cross it entirely. In 1761, a French ship destroyed itself on the reef surrounding this island in the middle of the night. Most of the crew survived. They spent 2 months on the island, built a new ship from the wreckage, and sailed away. They left behind between 60 and 80 people. Those people had been locked in the ship's cargo hold, transported illegally, without their knowledge or consent, to be sold. They had never seen the ocean before boarding that ship. They had no boats, no navigational tools, no means of signaling anyone, and no shared language with the sailors who abandoned them. They survived for 15 years. When a rescue ship finally reached the island in 1776, it found 7 women and 1 infant, a child born on the island, who had never known any other world. This is not a story about extraordinary courage or remarkable endurance in the dramatic sense. It is a story about what people do when waiting is no longer possible and there is nothing left but the work of staying alive. This is what those 15 years actually looked like. Chapter 1, The Isle of Sand. There is an island in the Indian Ocean that does not invite attention. It sits approximately 280 miles east of Madagascar and 300 miles northwest of Réunion, equidistant from everything, belonging to nothing. From the air, it appears as a pale comma of sand against deep blue water, so low and so flat that it seems less like land than like a temporary interruption of the ocean's surface. Its highest point rises just 7 meters above sea level. On most maps, it occupies less space than the text of its own name. The island was formed by a volcano. Over millions of years, the volcanic cone eroded completely, leaving only the coral reef structure and the thin layer of sand that accumulated within it. What remains above the waterline is approximately 1 square kilometer of exposed ground, roughly the footprint of a city block. There are no hills. There are no trees. There are no rivers, no springs, no source of fresh water of any kind. What grows on the island can be counted without difficulty. A few coarse grasses. Several low shrubs that do not reach knee height. Nothing that provides shade. Nothing that breaks the wind. The reef that surrounds the island is its most significant geographic feature, a submerged wall of coral that encircles the land and extends outward beneath the surface. It is not visible from a distance. It does not announce itself. For most of recorded history, the island had no permanent name. Sailors who knew of it called it simply the Isle of Sand. It was an accurate description. In July of 1761, it was about to become something else entirely. Chapter 2, L'Utile and its hidden cargo. In the mid-18th century, the Isle of France, the island now known as Mauritius, was a French colonial outpost in the southwestern Indian Ocean. It served as an administrative and commercial hub for French interests in the region, a stopping point for ships moving between Europe, Africa, and Asia. Its economy depended on plantation agriculture, and plantation agriculture, in that era, depended on enslaved labor. By 1761, the French crown had formally prohibited the importation of enslaved people to the Isle of France. The prohibition was not a moral position, it was a regulatory one, driven by the economics of colonial administration. The ban existed. Enforcement of it was another matter entirely. L'Utile was a French merchant vessel operating under royal contract. Its name meant, simply, the useful. It was a flute, a cargo ship design favored for its wide hull and significant carrying capacity. In the summer of 1761, it was assigned a routine mission, sail from the Isle of France to the eastern coast of Madagascar, collect a consignment of beef and rice, and return. The mission was straightforward. The timeline was short. The ship was expected back within days. What the ship's official manifest did not record was a separate arrangement that its captain, Jean de Lafargue, had made independently. Between the Isle of France and Madagascar, a significant trade in enslaved people continued despite the formal prohibition. The penalties for participation were real but inconsistently applied, and the financial incentives were, for those willing to accept the risk, considerable. Captain Jean had arranged to transport 160 men, women, and children of Malagasy descent, people taken from the central highlands of Madagascar, to Rodriguez Island, where they would be sold. They were loaded into the cargo hold before the ship departed. They were given no information about where they were being taken or why. The ship carried a crew of more than 140 men. It carried official cargo. And below deck, locked in the hold, it carried 160 human beings who had no knowledge of the ocean, no understanding of their destination, and no means of altering what was about to happen to them. Chapter 3, The Crossing and the Captain. Captain Jean de la Fargue was not an inexperienced sailor. He had navigated these waters before, understood the general behavior of the Indian Ocean in its winter months, and was familiar with the established routes between the Isle of France and Madagascar. He was also a man operating under compounding pressure. The official mission gave him a narrow timeline. The unofficial one, the transport and sale of 160 enslaved people, added a layer of urgency that could not be acknowledged openly. Every additional hour at sea was an hour in which the illegal cargo below deck remained undiscovered. The return journey from Madagascar began on the night of July 31, 1761. Conditions were not favorable. Winds were running at approximately 20 knots, and the ship was moving through darkness with limited visibility. 2 navigational charts were available aboard Lutiel, and they did not agree with one another. The discrepancy was not minor. The charts placed certain features in different positions, which meant that any navigation relying on either one introduced a margin of error that grew larger the faster the ship moved. The prudent response to this situation, reducing speed, heaving to, waiting for first light, was available to Captain Jean. He did not take it. Whether this decision reflected professional miscalculation, the pressure of his illegal enterprise, or simple overconfidence in his ability to navigate by dead reckoning in the dark is not recorded. What is recorded is the decision itself, to maintain speed through the night, through conflicting charts, through 20-knot winds, across a stretch of ocean he could not see clearly. The Isle of Sand lay directly in the ship's path. It was not marked accurately on either chart. And the reef that surrounded it, the submerged coral wall that extended outward from the island just below the surface, was not visible at night, in choppy water, from the deck of a ship moving at speed. Chapter 4, The Reef. The collision happened sometime after nightfall on July 31, 1761. Lutiel struck the reef at speed. The impact was not a glancing blow. The ship drove into the coral structure with enough force to open the hull immediately. Water entered through the breach in volume. In a vessel of Lutiel's size, a hull failure of that severity does not allow for extended response time. The sequence from impact to uncontrolled flooding was measured in minutes. Captain Jean and the crew responded to the emergency as sailors respond to any catastrophic hull failure, by attempting to save themselves first. Most of the crew abandoned ship and reached the island by swimming. The reef that had destroyed the vessel also, in this respect, served a practical function. It was close enough to shore that the distance to swim was survivable for men who knew how to swim in open water. 18 members of the crew did not make it. They were swept out by the currents and drowned. Below deck, the situation was categorically different. The 160 Malagasy in the cargo hold had no direct access to the upper deck. They had not been informed of what was happening. When the water began rising in the hold, those who could find a way out did so. Through the breach the reef had torn in the hull, through any opening available. Many could not. The historical record does not specify exactly how many were lost in the initial sinking, but the accounts that survive indicate that when Lutiel went under, which it did within minutes of the collision, a significant number of the Malagasy were still trapped inside. Estimates suggest that between 60 and 80 Malagasy survived the wreck and reached the island. The remainder went down with the ship. They had been locked in a cargo hold in the dark, transported without their knowledge or consent to a destination they had never been told, and when the ship that carried them sank, many of them sank with it. The ones who made it to shore stood on the sand as the sun began to rise. Chapter 5, What the Morning Showed. When daylight came on August 1, 1761, the full reality of the situation became visible for the first time. The wreck of Luteel was partially submerged on the reef. Debris had washed ashore through the night, planking, rope, barrels, fabric, fragments of the ship's interior. The island itself was now populated by more than 120 French crewmen and between 60 and 80 Malagasy survivors, all of them wet, most of them without provisions, standing on a flat expanse of sand 1 kilometer across with no shade, no fresh water, and no immediate means of signaling anyone. The island offered nothing that had not been delivered to it by the sea. What the survivors could see from the shoreline confirmed what the geography already dictated. There was no elevation from which to sight a distant ship. There were no trees from which to construct signals. The reef that had destroyed Luteel made the shallow water around the island extremely difficult to navigate, which meant that even if a passing vessel came within visual range, approaching close enough to effect a rescue would require careful, deliberate effort. The crewmen began organizing almost immediately, gathering debris, assessing what had washed ashore, establishing a basic inventory of salvageable materials. This activity had the character of professional response, sailors trained for emergencies enacting the procedures they knew. The Malagasy survivors stood apart from this activity. They had not been consulted. They had not been included. They did not speak the same language as the crew. They did not know where they were. They knew only that the ship was gone, that the ocean surrounded them on every side, and that no one was coming. Chapter 6, 2 Camps. The first days on the island established a pattern that would define the entire period of the stranding. The crew moved quickly to salvage what they could from the wreck and from the debris that continued washing ashore. Wood, rope, metal fittings, barrels, sail fabric, everything that could be retrieved was brought to shore and inventoried. Swimmers went out to the partially submerged wreck and returned with additional materials. Within the first several days, the crew had accumulated a considerable stockpile of usable goods, enough wood to consider construction, enough salvaged food to establish basic rations, enough metal to contemplate a forge. What they did not prioritize, in those first critical days, was fresh water. The island had none. Rain was the only source, and it had not rained since the wreck. The crew controlled the water that had been salvaged from the ship, and that water was not shared equally. The Malagasy, who had no standing in the crew's organizational hierarchy and no means of asserting themselves, received little of it. Within the first few days, 8 Malagasy died of dehydration. It was only after these deaths that the new acting commander, First Lieutenant Barthélemy Castellan du Vernet, who had assumed control after Captain Jean's mental collapse rendered him incapable of command, ordered that a well be dug. The digging produced water, though its quality and quantity were limited. Barthélemy organized the crew with the discipline of a military officer. An oven was constructed for cooking. A forge was assembled from salvaged metal components for working iron and copper. Shelters were erected. The camp took on the structured appearance of a temporary but functional settlement. The Malagasy were physically separated from all of this. The crew established their camp at one end of the island. The Malagasy occupied the other. The distance between the two groups was not large, the island did not permit large distances, but the separation was deliberate and maintained consistently. The Malagasy participated in certain shared labor when it was required of them. They did not participate in the decision-making. They did not receive equal shares of the food or water stores. Chapter 7, The Providence. Barthélemy's most significant decision on the island was not about water or food or shelter. It was about wood. Within weeks of the stranding, he ordered the construction of a vessel from the salvaged remains of Luteel. Not a raft. Not a simple platform of lashed timbers. A ship, a fully functional sailing vessel, built from wreckage on a sand island with no natural resources, by men working with salvaged tools in equatorial heat. The ambition of the project was considerable. The practical obstacles were equally so. The wood available was what had washed ashore from the wreck, irregular pieces of varying dimensions, some damaged by the impact, all of it salt-soaked. The tools were limited to what had been recovered from the ship. The workforce was the crew, supplemented in certain tasks by the Malagasy, though the nature and extent of Malagasy labor in the construction is not precisely documented in the surviving historical record. The work took approximately 2 months. When it was complete, the vessel was given a name, La Providence. It was a small ship by any practical standard, capable of carrying the crew but not, as it would transpire, anyone else. On September 27, 1761, less than 2 months after Luteel had struck the reef, La Providence was loaded with the crew's provisions and supplies and prepared for departure. The Malagasy were not invited aboard. Barthélemy made a promise before the ship left. He told the Malagasy survivors that a rescue vessel would be sent back for them. The historical record does not detail how this promise was communicated across the language barrier that separated the two groups, or whether the Malagasy fully understood what was being said. What is documented is the promise itself, and what followed from it. La Providence departed the Isle of Sand on September 27, 1761, carrying the surviving crew and leaving behind between 60 and 80 Malagasy men, women, and children with limited supplies, no vessel, and no means of leaving the island on their own. The ship did not look back. The social structure that had existed aboard Luteel had been transferred, intact, to the sand. Chapter 8, What was left behind. When La Providence disappeared beyond the horizon, the Malagasy were left with whatever the crew had not taken with them. The inventory was modest. Some salvaged food. A limited quantity of water. The oven and forge that had been constructed during the crew's occupation of the island. Copper bowls and iron cookware retrieved from the wreck. A quantity of wood, not enough to build another vessel of any significant size, but enough to work with. The physical infrastructure of the crew's camp remained, but the crew's organizational capacity, their navigational knowledge, and their tools for signaling passing ships had departed with them. What the Malagasy had, beyond these materials, was each other. The group that remained numbered between 60 and 80 people. They were, as a group, from the central highlands of Madagascar, an inland region, far from the coastline. They were not fishermen by background or training. They had no experience with ocean navigation. The sea that surrounded them on every side was not an environment any of them had grown up in or prepared for. Their relationship to the island's available food sources was further complicated by cultural context. Turtles came ashore on the island regularly, a significant potential food source. In the cultural traditions of the Malagasy Highlands, turtles carried a taboo against consumption. The precise nature and strength of this taboo varied across different communities and lineages, but for people already dislocated from everything familiar, the pressure to violate a deeply held cultural prohibition added another dimension to an already impossible situation. The taboo did not hold indefinitely. Hunger, sustained over weeks, altered the calculation. The turtles became food. The seabirds that inhabited the island proved to be the most consistently accessible food source. They were numerous, they landed on the island regularly, and they could be caught without equipment. Fish from the reef were also available, though the same reef that trapped the survivors on the island made fishing from the shoreline technically difficult. The Malagasy began, methodically and without alternative, to learn the island. They had not chosen it. They had not been prepared for it. But it was, for the foreseeable future, the only world available to them. Chapter 9, Building a Life in a Grave. The shelters the Malagasy built on the Isle of Sand were unlike anything the French crew had constructed during their 2 months on the island. The crew had built above ground, functional structures of salvaged wood and sail fabric, temporary in character, designed to last weeks rather than years. The Malagasy built differently. Drawing on a funerary architectural tradition from the central highlands of Madagascar, they dug pits into the sand and lined the walls with coral stones gathered from the shoreline and the shallow reef. The pits were then covered with stone roofs, creating small enclosed underground chambers that were cool, wind-resistant, and structurally stable in a way that above-ground construction on a flat, exposed, cyclone-prone island could not be. The form they used for shelter was, in the tradition they came from, reserved for the dead. In the Malagasy highlands, the dead were interred in stone-lined underground chambers, structures built with care and permanence, intended to house the deceased for generations. The survivors on the Isle of Sand adapted this form for the living because it was the form they knew, because the materials available, coral stone and sand, suited it, and because nothing else would have withstood the conditions. They lived, for 15 years, in structures their tradition had built for burial. Beyond shelter, the community organized itself around the resources the island provided. Seabirds were the primary food source, caught, cooked in the oven that remained from the crew's time on the island, and consumed with the discipline of a group that understood, through accumulating experience, that waste was not survivable. The copper bowls salvaged from Lutiel were used, repaired when they failed, and used again. When a bowl developed a hole, the Malagasy sourced copper from the remaining wreck materials, melted it in the forge, and fabricated a patch. They drilled rivets from rolled copper sheet using tools fashioned from bone and salvaged metal. They also made other things. Rings. Bracelets. Necklaces. A comb fashioned from copper sheet, its tines cut by hand. These objects were not purely functional. They were evidence of something the island could not extinguish, the human need to maintain, even in extremity, some form of a life that extends beyond mere survival. Chapter 10, The Raft That Did Not Return. At some point in the months following La Providence's departure, the precise date is not recorded, a group of Malagasy survivors completed a second construction project. They built a raft. The materials available were significantly more limited than what the French crew had worked with. The crew had used the bulk of the salvageable timber from Lutiel for La Providence. What remained was insufficient for anything approaching a proper vessel. The raft the Malagasy built was a modest platform, large enough, they judged, to carry a small group across open water toward Madagascar or any other landfall that might be reached before the ocean took them. 18 people boarded it. The decision to attempt the crossing was not irrational. The island was slowly killing them. People were dying, from illness, from malnutrition, from causes the historical record does not specify precisely. Waiting for the promised rescue ship had produced nothing. The raft represented the only active option available to people who had exhausted every passive one. The 18 who boarded it paddled away from the Isle of Sand and into the Indian Ocean. They were never seen again. The Indian Ocean between the Isle of Sand and Madagascar spans approximately 280 miles of open water. Without a sail, without navigational instruments, on a raft built from remnant timber by people with no ocean sailing experience, the crossing was almost certainly unsurvivable. Whether the raft capsized, broke apart, or simply drifted beyond any possibility of reaching land cannot be determined from the historical record. What is certain is that the island received no help from the 18 who left it. And the people who remained watched the horizon and waited. Chapter 11, 15 years. The years on the Isle of Sand did not pass evenly. The early period, the months immediately following La Providence's departure, had the character of waiting. The Malagasy had been given a promise. They had reason, however diminishing, to believe it might be kept. The structures they built, the routines they established, the systems they developed for food and water and shelter all carried within them the implicit assumption that this was temporary. That a ship would come. That the island was a chapter, not a conclusion. That assumption eroded slowly and then completely. La Providence had arrived safely in Madagascar after 4 days at sea. Barthélemy, having survived the crossing, was summoned to answer for the illegal transport of the Malagasy and the loss of Lutiel. He was reprimanded. And then, despite the reprimand, he began asking the governor of the Isle of France to send a rescue ship back to the island. He asked repeatedly. He was refused repeatedly. France was at war. The 7 Years' War against Britain consumed the colonial administration's resources and attention, and no vessel could be spared for a rescue mission to retrieve people the official record had never formally acknowledged. On the island, people continued to die. The causes are not fully documented: illness, malnutrition, the accumulated physical toll of years of exposure on a flat, windswept, sun-beaten island with limited food and marginal fresh water. 3 years after the wreck, approximately 45 of the original survivors were dead. Of the 60 to 80 who had made it ashore from Luteel, only around 15 remained. The island had reduced them, year by year, to almost nothing. Chapter 12, The Dauphin. Barthélemy did not stop asking. For 11 years following the wreck, he directed requests toward anyone with the authority to act, the governor of the Isle of France, the minister of marine affairs in Paris, French naval officials, members of the colonial administration. He wrote letters. He involved the French press. He pursued the matter with a persistence that the historical record documents clearly, even as the record also documents how consistently he was refused. In 1772, the Minister of Marine Affairs finally agreed to authorize a rescue mission. The 7 Years' War had ended. The political obstruction that had blocked every previous request was no longer absolute. What followed was slow. Ships were dispatched and turned back. A vessel reached the outer reef in 1775 and withdrew without landing. Another attempt failed in the same year. A rescue rowboat was shattered on the reef in 1776, stranding one of its crew members on the island alongside the Malagasy. Then, on November 29, 1776, 15 years and 4 months after Luteel struck the reef, the French warship Dauphin, under the command of Captain Jacques-Marie Boudin de Tromelin, successfully reached the island. What the crew found when they landed was this: 7 women and 1 infant, 8 months old, born on the island. They were the only survivors. The women were wearing clothes they had woven from the feathers of seabirds. Chapter 13, What the Sand Kept. The island was renamed. In recognition of the officer who had finally reached it, the Isle of Sand became Tromelin Island, the name it carries today on every nautical chart, every map, every satellite image of that small pale comma of coral and sand in the southwestern Indian Ocean. The 7 women were brought to the Isle of France. The new governor declared them free. He arranged for their return to Madagascar. They refused to go. Whether this refusal reflected fear of another ocean crossing, attachment to the only community they had left, or something the historical record has not preserved, is not known. The governor accepted their decision and granted them citizenship. The infant and his mother and grandmother were taken into the governor's household. After that, history lost track of them. What remains is the island itself, and what archaeologists have recovered from it since 2006, the coral stone shelters, the repaired copper bowls, the handmade jewelry, the bone tools, the comb fashioned from sheet copper by hands that had learned, on a sand island with nothing, to make almost everything. 15 years. 7 women. 1 child born into the only world it had ever known. The ocean does not preserve what happened there. The sand does not either, except in fragments, objects made by people who were never meant to survive, who were never meant to be remembered, and who built a life anyway in the only place they had left. They had no name for what they were doing. They were simply continuing.